TBC, and welcome back to our journey through the book of Acts. We have been following the journeys of Paul and Barnabas over the last couple weeks, and we are going to continue. We saw them being sent out in chapter 13, and they traveled on to Pisidian Antioch, where their message was met with mixed reviews. Some accepted and decided to follow Jesus, while others persecuted them and eventually expelled them from the region. And so we left with Barnabas and Paul shaking the dust from their feet and heading on to their next location filled with joy and the Holy Spirit. And so Acts 14 is going to continue to follow the journey of Paul and Barnabas as they continue on down the Via Sebaste, which is a Roman road that was built by Augustus, and it was built to connect military colonies in that region. And so this was a paved road, and they continue from Pisidian Antioch all the way down eventually to Lystra and Derbe, and part of the road will become unpaved at that point. And then Acts 14 is also going to follow their return journey as they go back and eventually end up back in Antioch, where they share about all that God is doing. Now, I wanted us to start here by thinking about this route that they were on, because travel in the ancient world is nothing like what we experience today. If we want to go to, say, Houston, we're going to get in the car and we're going to drive there. We're going to hop on an airplane and get there even faster. And that is kind of the reality of our travel. Thinking of loading everything up that you need for a trip and taking a walk to get there is just not part of our normal day-to-day. Now, Paul and Barnabas, though, would have been traveling most likely on foot, and they were traveling quite a long distance. So they land here first at Iconium, which was 90 miles southeast of Pisidian Antioch, where we left them at the end of chapter 13. So if you think about how long that would have taken, 90 miles is quite a ways. Even if they were going really quickly and able to cover 20 to 30 miles a day, we're talking about 3 to 5 days just to travel. And that's just mostly walking all day long. And that is one of the thoughts I was having as I was reading through this section, is we follow Paul on his journeys, Paul and Barnabas here, and they go from place to place, and the narrative moves quickly. And sometimes that we can lose that passage of time that would have taken for them to travel there. And I think that is a helpful reminder that they didn't just go from Pisidian Antioch straight to Iconium in just about 24 hours. It would have taken them days to travel there. Now, Iconium is where they travel first. And as I said, it's 90 miles southeast of Pisidian Antioch. And then they will go on to Lystra and Derbe. And all of this is in Asia Minor. So chapter 14 opens with them arriving at Iconium, and they go initially into the Jewish synagogues. Paul and Barnabas tend to begin in the synagogue when they arrive in a new area, and we'll see Paul continue this. We've already seen him do that. We'll continue to see this pattern. And they go, and initially they're speaking so effectively that many were told, great number of Jews and Greeks believed. But the Jews who refused to believe, stirred up other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So even though many believed, they continue to be plagued by these groups of people who don't, and particularly Jews, and they stir up trouble. This phrase, poisoned their minds, is such a vivid image for me of what is happening. They are completely turning the people's minds away from the message that Paul and Barnabas have. And they even go on, as we continue reading in these first 7 verses here, to incite violence against them. But regardless, Paul and Barnabas still spent time there. It's a considerable time there. And they spoke boldly for the Lord. And they preach despite the opposition, and they stay for quite a while before they move on to the next place. There is a plot that is beginning to develop by both Jews and Gentiles and some of the leaders, and they want to persecute Paul and Barnabas. It says mistreat them and stone them, but they hear about it and they flee. They're able to leave, and so they stayed as long as their staying was effective. And then once they realized that this was about to take a turn for the worse, they're able to leave, and they flee to the surrounding country, to the cities of Lystra and Derbe, and they continue to preach the gospel. Now, Lystra is about 20 miles southwest of Iconium, and Derbe is about 63 miles further away, and it's on an unpaved path. So they'd been on a paved road. And when you think of a paved road, think of like cobblestone kind of road, but still a paved road. And then the road to Derbe would be unpaved. But as they're going, they're continuing to preach everywhere they go. And they arrive in Lystra. And the scene that we have here is very similar to when Peter heals the lame man at the temple way back in Acts 3. So we have here, starting in verse 8, that we're told that there was a man who was lame, and he had been that way from birth and had never walked. And he listened to Paul as he was speaking, and Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." And at that moment, the man jumped up and began to walk. So once again, a man who has never been able to walk from birth is able to, in an instant, walk. That is an amazing miracle, amazing sign. And as we see with other miracles in the book of Acts, the miracle is not supposed to draw attention to the one performing it, but to God who is working through Paul, or back in Acts 3, working through Peter. So we see any of these miracles, that the attention is supposed to be drawn to God. But the people here in Lystra are terribly confused, and they misunderstand, and they think that now what they have is an appearance of Zeus and Hermes in their midst, and they began to try to worship Paul and Barnabas. And they think Barnabas is Zeus and that Hermes is Paul, because Hermes was the messenger god. And Paul and Barnabas didn't understand this at first because they didn't speak the language. Then as they realize that they have to try to get them to stop. This instance of the people thinking it was Zeus and Hermes is very unique to this region, because Zeus was worshipped throughout the region of Galatia, which is where they were. And there have been carvings found by archaeologists that show Zeus accompanied by Hermes. And if you think about, if you've ever read any of Homer's writings, the Iliad or the Odyssey, this idea that the gods were going to show up in human form and in disguise, really, and appear, it was a very common belief. And there was a local folk tale of Zeus and Hermes in this region appearing in such a disguise, but being rejected by the majority of people and only being welcomed in by an elderly couple. And so then this elderly couple is rewarded and made priests and all sorts of things for their hospitality, while all of the others are punished. And so we have all of this kind of forming the background for what's happening here in Acts 14 and why these people immediately respond. They don't want to make the same mistake that all of those other people made in the story. They want to be ready in case this is really Zeus and Hermes. But Paul and Barnabas are saying, no, that is not what's happening. Then we see Paul and Barnabas respond by tearing their clothes, because that is the sign of hearing blasphemy. That was a very Jewish response to hearing blasphemy. They tear their clothes. And then Paul begins to speak. He said, "Why are you doing this? We're only human just like you." And he says, "We're bringing you the good news to tell you to turn from these worthless things, so these worthless idols, and turn to the living God." And then instead of appealing to scripture like he has done when he's in the synagogue, instead we see Paul begin to appeal to creation. Everything around, because these people don't have a Jewish background here in Lystra. These are Gentiles he's talking to. And so he contextualizes his message so that they can understand, because they aren't going to care what the Jewish scriptures say, but they can look around them and they can see that there's creation. And so Paul says, turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. And he says, he's shown you kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. And he provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. And so he appeals to them by pointing to God as creator. So things that they can actually see. He created all of these things. So Paul is finding common ground in which to share the good news of the gospel. And really, this is the first speech we have in Acts that is geared towards people who don't have a Jewish background. And so I love to see how Paul interacts with them. Yes, there's been Gentiles that he's spoken to before, but this scene particularly is very much a Gentile scene. So let's look at verse 18. So Paul says all of these things and preaches to them. And then we're told, even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. So they just really were struggling to comprehend what was going on. But then we're told in verse 19 that some Jews from Antioch and Iconium won the crowd over. So these people who have been persecuting and opposing Paul and Barnabas this whole time followed them all the way there. And they win the crowd over. So remember, we were told at Iconium they were poisoning the minds of all of those people. But now here they're doing it again, and they turn the crowd. And so the crowd moves from wanting to worship Paul and Barnabas to wanting to stone them. And so we're told that they stoned Paul. So we're not even told that they want to. They do it. They stone him and drag him outside the city thinking he's dead. But after the disciples gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. And the next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. So why exactly did they want to stone Paul? We're not told specifically, other than that the Jews from Antioch and Iconium kind of won the crowd over. Perhaps they were really bothered by what Paul had to say about saying that all of these other idols were worthless. I mean, that probably bothered some of them. But regardless, they do. But Paul is left for dead. And I love this image of the disciples gathering around him. And we're not really told what they're doing. Were they praying? Oh, probably. I mean, why wouldn't they be praying? It would be a very natural response. But they circled around him and he gets up and continues on like nothing's happened. And he just keeps moving on. Then we're told in verse 21 that they're able to preach in Derbe and win a large number of disciples there in that city. And then they return. They go back to all of these places where all of these people have opposed them and stoned them and threatened to stone them. And they've endured all of this hardship. And they go back to strengthen the disciples and encourage them to remain true to the faith. That's in verse 22. So they go and retrace their steps to go find all of these baby Christians who have just decided to follow Jesus and are still learning what that means. And they go back and give them encouragement. They return to those places where it was dangerous for them to be, where people were after them, wanting to kill them. And they return because they want to strengthen these new believers. And they give them this message that we're going to have to go through hardships. This is part of following Jesus. Suffering is going to happen. We can't avoid it. Following Jesus isn't going to make us immune from it. Instead, he's going to be with us while we go through it. And so they talk about that, and they were told that they appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. So they helped them set up leadership and establish those churches in this area. And eventually they go back and retrace their steps all the way back to Antioch in Syria. Now, one of the interesting things about this ministry tour that we've read here in chapter 14 is it would have been really easy for them to be completely discouraged by what had happened to them. They were chased through, really from Pisidia and Antioch, they just kept being chased from place to place and pushed out and expelled and persecuted and all of these things. But they're willing to endure all of this to declare the good news. This gospel is good news despite the bad, terrible things they are enduring. And it is worth it to them to be able to share that with people. And one of the other things that I thought was really interesting is like in Lystra, we're not really told that anybody believes, right? We have the scene of the people wanting to worship Paul and Barnabas and then they stone them. We're not really told that anybody in that area is wanting to believe. But one interesting thing I read this week in my commentary that I had forgotten is that Timothy, who is going to be one of Paul's closest sons of the faith, is from Lystra. So despite all that Paul is enduring, Timothy is going to come to faith here from this region. And that is such a cool God moment to realize, is that despite all of this, and even though we don't hear of any of the fruit right here, the fruit will come because Timothy is going to follow Jesus. We know that. Paul's going to travel with him and talk about him in many of his letters and have 2 letters to him. So what a cool testimony to the work that God is doing through Paul and Barnabas in this region. So they return back to Antioch in Syria, retracing their steps all the way back. And they arrive, let's look at verse 27. They gather in the church together and report all that God had done through them and how he'd opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And it says they stayed there a long time with the disciples. So they return and they declare all the awesome things that God is doing. And I can imagine the church just being overjoyed and just filled with just such awe what God is doing in the lives of people. And we see the gospel being flung that much further away from Jerusalem and so many more people coming to faith. And this point about the Gentiles coming to faith is going to come up as we continue reading in Acts 15 in our next video, because the church is going to have to deal with this. What does it mean that now an increasing number of believers are not just Jewish followers of Jesus, but are Gentile followers of Jesus? And how are we going to deal with that? And so we're going to get to talk about that next week. How does the church deal with this? So I will see you again in the next video when we will continue our journey through Acts. Bye.